Hey guys, welcome back to Learn Python the Hard Way. Today we're going to focus on exercise 24, which is going to be another practice exercise. As always, you can find the link to the current chapter in the description below. Since this is part of the paid section of the book, Learn Python the Hard Way, you would actually have to purchase the book to follow along, or alternatively, of course, feel free to just take a look at the video and follow along with me here. So exercise 24 is actually a practice exercise. So we are finishing up the first section of the book where we learned a lot of the concepts, and then going forward we're actually going to go more into actual programming and into developing more complex scripts and applications. But this exercise here is one of the recap exercises to basically build up some stamina, to build up some muscle memory, and to get more familiar with the concepts that we learned before. So let's get started right away with writing out the exercise code. And to do that, as always, we can open the terminal window here by pressing Command space key on the Mac, for example, or opening the separate terminal application on Windows, and then we can navigate to the appropriate folder. And from here, as always, we can open a new Python file. I'm using Visual Studio Code, therefore I'm going to type in code and then followed by the name of the Python file. So in this case, exercise24.py. This is going to open a new Python file, and we can get started by actually printing out the first statement. So that's just a regular print statement here. Let's practice everything that we learned so far. So the first aspect here are escape sequences, and also note that we are using actually single quotes for this print statement, so we can either use single quote or double quotes. And in this case here, we are escaping, for example, the quotation mark here, but we can, for example, also escape a backslash character. And of course, it's also possible to escape for example, new lines here and also tabs. Next, we're going to create a multi-line string by using 3 quotation marks. Let's start that off with a tab. And here, of course, we are not only inserting a tab at the beginning, but also a new line in the middle of this line here, so that will, of course, be rendered, be printed out in a separate line. Alright, so that's a beautiful poem here that we store in the poem variable. Next, we're going to print out a number of dashes here. Then we print our poem, which we stored in that variable up here. And after that, we're going to print out another separator here with different dashes. Next, let's define a new variable where we actually do some computations, and we store that in the variable 5 here. Now we're using printf to actually render the content of the variable, and again we have to use curly braces in here within the quotation marks, and in front of the string, right after the print statement and the open parentheses, we need to enter an F in order to make sure that it's actually rendered, so that's a printf, a formatted string that we are printing out here. After that, we are going to define a function called secret formula, which takes one parameter called started. And again, we should make sure to have 4 space characters here, and then we define a new variable called started jelly beans, and we take the argument started here and multiply it by 500 and store that back in jelly beans. Next, we take our jelly beans, divide them by 1000 and store that in jars. And we create a new variable crates, which is jars divided by 100. And then finally, our function is going to return something. So here at the end, we are going to return jelly beans, jars, and crates. So all the three variables that we defined previously. Let's define a new variable called start point with a value of 10,000. And now we are going to define three new variables in a single line called beans, jars, crates. And here we're going to call secret formula, and we will pass in the start point, which of course is our value of 10,000. And then as we can see here, our function will return jelly beans, jars, crates, and that will be associated with those three variables here. So with beans, jars, crates. Alright, after that we add a comment in here. And here we are using a print statement again, but instead of using printf, we're using the format function. So first of all, we're going to type out our string. And here at the end of the string, we are using the curly braces, which again represents that we want to insert some data in there. And now we're going to call .format and pass in the starting point variable. And now, other than what we did before with printf, here format works the way that it takes a look at the string itself, and wherever the curly braces are being used, format will then insert that variable that we pass into format in the parentheses. So that's another comment. It's just like with an f string. So here we can basically have an f string. We'd have beans, and we can print out all those variables here in our print statement. All right. Next, let's define a new variable called start point, which we define as start point divided by 10. So basically we take the start point variable, which we already set up here, and we're going to divide it by 10. And instead of writing it this way, what we could also do is like this here. We could say we want to do divide equals 10, so that would be the shorthand form for that. But let's change it back to the original one. Now let's print out. We can also do that this way. Formula equals secret formula, so our function from before, and we pass in the start point again. This is an easy way to apply a list to a format string, and here we print out we'd have beans, jars, and again we are adding those placeholders in here to basically replace those placeholders, those open closed curly braces, with some actual code. And to do that we call format on that string, and we pass in formula. And here in this case, in order to pass in multiple values at once, because formula here, what the variable it contains is basically the return value for secret formula. And if we think back about to that, we can see that it actually returns three variables, which are then stored in formula as a list. And in order to pass all of those three values directly to our string here, we then can't just call formula on it, but we need to write out asterisk formula. And that should be it. So let's save that file here, and let's head back to our terminal. And here, of course, we are going to execute our file by typing out Python 3.6 or Python 3 and then followed by the name of the file, so exercise 24.py. Let's press enter and compare that to the solution here. So we start out by printing out let's practice everything, the first print statement. After that we have the second print statement here where we actually escaped, for example, those quotation marks and also that backslash character here. So you'd need to know about escapes with backslash, that do. And then we have in the next print statement actually a new line, which is why this line here is empty. The new line, and in front of tabs we have another, we inserted the tab, so that's why we have those spaces here, or that tab. After that we defined the poem string, which is this multi-line string, and we don't print that out yet, but instead we print out those dashes here, which is what we see here. Then we print out the poem, which again it includes a backslash n character, so we have a new line in here, and then we print the dashes again. So this is what we see here. After that we had our variable 5, which is set to this calculation, so 10 minus 2 plus 3 minus 6, and then we print the result out. So this should be 5 is equal to 5, which is what this variable evaluates to. Then we have the function definition here for our secret formula, and we define a start point, which has a value of 10,000, and we store the return value of secret formula, which takes a start point, so the value of 10,000, we store that in beans, jars, and crates in those 3 different variables. After that we print out the string here with the starting point of, and we pass in the start point using .format. So this is what we see here with the starting point of 10,000, which is the value that start point has. After that we have printf, which is the alternative to using format. So here we print out we'd have and then beans, so the value of beans using the curly braces, jars and crates. So here we see that it evaluates to this number here. So 5 million beans, 5,000 jars and 50 crates. We print out, we can also do it this way. And then finally we have this print statement here, which is basically an alternative to using printf, which we did up here. Instead of directly typing in the different variables in those curly braces, what we can do instead is we can just insert those curly braces in a string here. We don't add f in front of it, but then we have to call .format on it and pass in those different variables. And in our case here, we actually pass in a list because we created that formula list here, that formula variable, and we passed in start point. We got back from calling secret formula those 3 different variables here, which are then stored in formula, and we pass formula here to our print statement. So that's the last line we have here. So quite a long script, but it includes many of the concepts that we learned about in the previous exercises. So let's take a look at the study drills. First of all, make sure to do your checks, read it backwards, read it out loud, and put comments about above confusing parts. So we basically just did that. We basically went through the entire Python script here and talked about this, what it does, and we read it back. So we basically covered that part. The second study drill is to break the file on purpose, then run it to see what kind of errors you get. Make sure you can fix it. So let's take a look at how we can actually break our script here. So maybe one option might be here to take that star away from formula. And let's see if that already breaks our script. So we can see here at the bottom, we have indeed an error. So here is an index error, replacement index 1 out of range for positional args tuple. So here it doesn't know how to handle the list in itself. So we always need to make sure to actually pass the asterisk here, and then it should be printed out properly. Now if we break it in a different way, let's say for example here for the print statement we remove the f in this case, and let's just remember this printed out before. This should be 5:5, so this value here. Now if we clear the screen by pressing Ctrl L and then running this one more time, we can now see that the statement here is still printed out. There's not a direct error, but instead of rendering the value for 5 for that variable, it directly prints out literally curly braces, 5 close curly braces. So in those cases, we always need to make sure that we actually insert the f in here. And then if we run that one more time, it actually renders our values here and is displayed properly. So these are some of the ways how we can break our code and make sure that we really understand what's going on. So let's finally take a look at some common student questions. The first one is, why do you call the variable jelly_beans, but the name's beans later? So let's take a look at that. Here we have the variable jellybeans within the secret formula function. And then later on, we are using the variable beans, for example, here. So the secret formula function here with the start point returns jelly beans, jars, and crates. And here, instead of calling it jelly beans, we just called it beans, which of course we can do since the return value here from the formula is basically independent to the variable that we assign it to. So we get jelly beans back, but actually just the value of it, and we can associate it with a different variable. So the answer here is it's part of how a function works. Remember that inside the function here, the variable is temporary. When you return it, which is basically what happens at the end of the function, or actually when we call the function. So when we return it, then it can be assigned to a variable for later use, so which is what we do here. We're just making a new variable named beans to hold the return value, precisely. So this value here is really independent of what's going on within the function itself. It's just temporary. The variable just lives within the scope of this function, and when it returns the value, basically jelly beans, the variable does no longer exist, but just the value gets returned and we can bind it to a different variable. What do you mean by reading the code backward, which is what was part of the first exercise here? Start at the last line here at the very bottom. Compare that line in your file to the same line in mine, which is basically over here. Once it's exactly the same, move up to the next line. Do this until you get to the first line of the file. So if there was any error, if the output would be different to what we actually were expecting, then it makes sense to go line by line and actually check what kind of error we made here. And finally, who wrote that poem? The author did. Not all of his poems suck. Nice. Alright, so that's exercise 24, and see you guys in the next video with exercise 25.